So this is actually refreshing because this is the first presentation I've done now live in front of an audience in 2 years, which means I don't get the whole cheating of actually looking at my notes into a Zoom screen anymore. So if I forget where I am halfway through, that's why, out of practice. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk through the evolution of modern ransomware and how we kind of got to this point over time. So we'll go through the tactics, techniques, and procedures that these different groups use. We'll talk about how you can understand that to use it to defend against them. But most of all, I want to let you understand how we got to where we are today and where it's likely to go next. So we'll start off with this. This is a really important slide. This is the AIDS ransomware Trojan. And the reason why it's important is it shows up in just about every damn ransomware presentation where somebody will normally show you a picture of a 5 1/4 inch floppy disk and tell you that ransomware all started back in 1989 with this thing. It didn't. It's true that malware that could encrypt devices and networks and so on did exist back then. But this Trojan has about as much in common with today's modern ransomware as a cart pulled by a half-blind donkey called Dave has with a high-end Tesla. It's utterly irrelevant. So what we're going to talk about instead is ransomware as a service. So what is ransomware as a service and how did we get to kind of where we are? Well, we'll go back in time a bit to about the 2000s, first of all, to tell you what was kind of before this. And that was theft-based cybercrime models. So by and large, whether it was banking Trojans, credit card stealing, password stealing, doesn't matter. All of the all of the malware back then was focused on stealing information and then monetizing it by selling it in some way, shape, or form, right? And that was highly successful for a long time, or at least it was successful by those standards. It's nothing compared to what ransomware does today. Fast forward a bit later, and we notice that a whole service industry spins up in the kind of malware infrastructure. So whether this was the case of the kind of emerging cloud industry that was out at the time and people seeing how successful that was, or maybe some cyber criminals got a Jeff Bezos biography for Christmas, I'm not entirely sure. But either way, everything started to become services. So you want to send phishing emails, you want to compromise networks, you want to do money laundering, you want to do any of that stuff, there's a service for it. So if you want to think of an analogy, imagine spam. Imagine you want to get your malware out to as many people around the world as you possibly want to. So instead of having to code all that yourself, which would have been the previous way of doing things, you'd simply go and find a service provider who will send the spam for you. And they will guarantee, 1 million spam per day, and they will get it delivered to certain countries and so on. And the nice part of the service model is you don't need to understand how that actually works, right? You just trust that they have a good reputation and they'll do what they said they would. So whether they're doing it through a whole botnet of machines they're using for spamming, or they've compromised mail servers around the world, doesn't really matter, not your problem. Just like when you spin up a EC2 instance in a cloud in Amazon, you don't really need to know how it works under the hood. As long as it works, everything's good and everything's happy days. The other advantage of this service model is it makes things incredibly scalable for criminals. So now when you want to run a criminal business, you just need to come up with the idea, the business model, you essentially stitch together all the different services you need to make that happen. And then you do a quick calculation that if the money you're paying out for those services is less than the amount of money that you will make, and it will be, then you have a profitable criminal business. And it's just a case of running that. And it's really, really scalable. The other thing that evolved over this time period was ransomware itself. So I mentioned that before kind of ransomware became as big as it is today, we had mostly theft-based models, right? Theft is the crime that actually it all boils down to. Banking Trojans, whatever, it doesn't matter. The core crime was theft of information. There's a problem though with theft of information. So as our information got bigger and bigger, the theft of it actually is hard to monetize. So if you can imagine I had my laptop, my work laptop in front of me here, and somebody in the audience actually compromises the work laptop, and they have access now to gigabytes of Trend Micro software, projects I'm working on, my email, folder with Star Wars fan fiction if you really want that one, all that sort of stuff. That's great, but I want you to think like criminals for a minute and think, how do you monetize that? So first of all, who would you sell that to? And how much would you charge for it, right? There is an underground community of Star Wars Reylo fans who will pay good money for some of the stuff I've written, but good luck finding those people, right? So instead, they thought, well, this is bad enough when we have just Bob's laptop. What about when we have 1,000 people's computers to go through on a daily basis? So what they did instead is they came up at a different model, and that is quite simply extortion instead of theft, right? Fundamentally different type of crime. And the idea here is they know the data on the compromised machine is valuable, but they don't know to who it's actually valuable, right? But there's one person who absolutely definitely thinks that information is valuable. That's you, because it's your data, right? So simply denying you access to that data and then charging you for it back means they've got a guaranteed customer in these cases. And that then led to this emergence of extortion-based crime. So fundamentally different, as I said, from the theft-based crime that went before. And as we see, it actually can be a lot more profitable. So what I want to do next is I want to take us through an evolution a bit over time. That's a high level view, but like how did we kind of evolve through the different stages of ransomware to this point? Well, first of all, if we have to start out, the very start of ransomware, we start with, no, not a mess, we're not going to go through this. Right, not this, skipping ahead. The early days of ransomware were about 2010-ish, approximately. And back then, what ransomware looked like might look completely different to what you see with ransomware today. So I assume everybody knows how ransomware generally works. You deploy malware on a machine, it encrypts files that are important to that person, and then it charges a ransom through some note of some description and says, pay this money, and you get your files back. Simple out, right? So back in about 2010, how this worked was it was primarily targeting home users, and the ransom amounts were kind of in the hundreds or maybe thousands. And part of the limiting factor there was how they had to get paid. So a lot of the payment ransomware, if you see back then, was actually paid over like SMS, not like just a straight up SMS, but some countries have systems where you can send funds up to hundreds or thousands over SMS. So for example, in Russia and some of the Russian speaking countries, this happened. The downside to that is, it was good money by the time, but it also is limited by geography, right? So if you have a Russian number in your ransomware, it's only going to work for them. It's not going to work in Ireland. You have to find a, equivalent service to make it work over here and so on. So it doesn't scale particularly well. Fast forward a bit, and we have the start of much more mass ransomware. So the big differentiator here was Bitcoin. So with Bitcoin emerging, you now had a way that anybody in the world who could essentially buy Bitcoin through some local exchange can now transfer money to the criminal. Right? And even nicer, there's a whole anonymizing nature that comes with Bitcoin as well. So it makes it even nicer for them. So this then led to the spread of mass ransomware on a global scale where they could get paid. And in the process, this was kind of when we moved from it targeting home users to it also hitting companies. It didn't really so much target companies as the fact that it was just hitting everything. And that was also affecting customer or companies as well. Fast forward a little bit further and we get to the start of what's kind of modern ransomware at the moment. So the key differentiator was in a couple of years after ransomware went and exploded, all the different security vendors basically upgraded their solutions, thought about it, figured out how to stop it. And generally speaking, if you have a modern kind of security solution that does things like can detect encryption when it's happening, right, through any method, protect certain folders from being even accessed, has decent backups, all of those type of things make a really big dent in stopping ransomware as we know it. Unless, of course, some scenario where the attackers had compromised the network so completely that they had full admin access of the network and they've disabled all of those security solutions, in which case you're screwed, right? But that's not going to really happen. Turns out that's exactly what happens. So because these security solutions were getting better, the criminals needed a way to get around that. And the easiest way to do that was moving from a more mass ransomware type approach then to a heavily targeted approach where there would be actually humans on the network disabling security software, working their way around and so on. And obviously to make that whole model work, you have to charge more money for it or make more money out of every single victim. And that brings us up to what we kind of see today with the kind of modern double extortion ransomware, which I'll get into in just a minute. So it's much more targeted. It's no longer the kind of volume business we saw in the past, but the ransoms can be exceptionally high, making instant millionaires in some cases. So before we dive more into this trend, and we'll talk about where it's going to go next, I want to just backtrack for a minute and look into it from the criminal's point of view. Because seeing this evolution from a criminal point of view sometimes really helps you to think, how do I defend against all of this? So we're going to take an example that ultimately leads up to a Trojan or to a ransomware called Nephilim. And we're going to start off with this individual, which is JS Worm in early 2019. So 2 things to point out before we go any further. First of all the original posts here were written in Russian text, which we've machine translated for you. You're welcome. That's also why some of the text doesn't make sense. And secondly, obviously the author's name is not really JSWorm. Nobody's parents hate them that much. This is just one of the various handles that they actually use at the time. So JSWorm started out their career with a remote administration Trojan, or a RAT, called RAVC-RAT, right? Very common for criminals to start out this way. And by RAT standards, it's pretty decent. Nothing wrong with it. It does all the kind of things you'd expect from a RAT or a keylogger. It gives you, remote reverse proxies, file manager, keyloggers, backdoor capability, all that kind of stuff. It does all of those things. And keyloggers and RATs are a very common entry point for criminals because they're not hard to code. There's a lot of source code out there they can just take, adapt, and modify a little bit. But it's also not terribly profitable, right? You might sell a keylogger or a RAT for a couple of $100. And people don't return back to you that often to keep buying from you, right? So as a business model, not terribly profitable. So this particular actor, JSWorm, is quite the entrepreneur and kind of moves on over time and sees this ongoing trend of the mass ransomware that was happening at the time. So created their own version called JSWorm Ransomware, which no prizes for originality on the naming there. And when we look from a technical point of view, it's well written. It's nothing groundbreaking, but ransomware doesn't really have to be. It just has to encrypt files, right? You can technically throw everything into a password protected zip file and it's a ransomware, right? It's not a particularly good one, but it still kind of works. So in their case, what was more interesting was the amount of ways this got onto a system. So when you looked at it, JSWorm ransomware was being spread over email. It was being spread through drive-by downloads, through direct infections, RDP connections, literally any sort of infection method you can think of, this thing was being spread by. So how is that happening? How is it this widespread? Well, the reason it's this widespread is down to this line here. So it mentions that they have a 70-30 split between an affiliate and themselves. How does that work? So what they essentially were doing, the business model here is that they partner with affiliates or like kind of pen tester, initial infection type people. They break into the network. They deploy their backdoors and things around it until they've complete control of the network. And finally, they drop the ransomware component for you. And to make that work for everybody, the affiliate takes 70% of the overall ransomware profits and 30% goes to the actual ransomware author, right? So he doesn't have to do half as much work for the effort, so that's why they're not getting paid as much money. And that's also why you see so many different infection vectors here, because there's different affiliates in every case doing this. It's also why if you're an IR company and you're looking at a ransomware incident, it can be really hard to put together the kill chain because there isn't one kill chain. There's like 2 or 3 kill chains all overlapping that you're trying to detangle from each other. So fast forward a bit further, click, and in about the end of 2019, JSWorm changes and brings out a new ransomware called NIMTY. Now, NIMTY operates using the exact same kind of split and affiliate model that JSWorm had, so 70-30. The file itself isn't massively different from what came before. So the question would be, why bother rebranding this, right? And if you look into details, it kind of does a lot of the same stuff and gives details before about the 70-30 split. So the answer is we don't 100% know why they would have done this and kind of rebranded, but if I had to guess, I would guess it's down to they wanted to cut out some of the affiliates that they were working with up to that point. So if you can imagine for a minute, imagine being a startup and going into a frat house in California and saying, hands up who wants to join a tech startup. You will get some really talented people who will jump on board and you'll get a bunch of wasters in the process, right? So fast forwarded like 6 months of doing this and there was probably some affiliates that they worked with that just did their head in and were not particularly useful and not particularly profitable and they wanted to get rid of. So when they advertised NIMTY, they actually limited to only 25 affiliates they would work with. And they would even offer up to 90-10 split for really good affiliates who could get them onto a lot of good networks, right? So this is just a case of them kind of trimming the fat off their business, if you like. Moving forward then a bit again, and around the end of 2019, start of 2020 was when this whole new world of double extortion ransomware was starting up. And I haven't really explained double extortion ransomware yet, but I will in just a minute. And JSWorm, ever the entrepreneur, jumped on this bandwagon with a new Trojan, new ransomware, which they called Nephilim. It was actually originally called NIMTY Revenue Edition, which is what they marketed as originally. So what's the difference between this and the others? Well, it's the whole double extortion model. So if you don't know the double extortion model, the idea is the affiliates get on the network, they go around, and they're going to deploy the ransomware. But before they actually do that, they hoover up any files they can from anywhere in the network that they think would be sensitive, right? So obviously your source code, your like sales details, the Star Wars fan fiction I mentioned earlier, all of that gets zipped up in one file, like a couple of gigabytes in size, and then exfiltrated off the network to some other location under the attacker's control. And then once all that is done, they deploy the ransomware and all the endpoints, and at that point, the board realizes they're actually under attack. So this has two things the board have to kind of consider at this point. One, they're dealing with the fact their systems are mostly offline, so they can't work, they can't do whatever it is the business is actually doing. That's the ransomware component. And the second part is they have this looming kind of possible GDPR breach that they have to deal with on the back end, which is a very powerful kind of card that the attacker can bring in mid-negotiation to kind of put extra pressure on whenever they need to use that at that point. A couple of other things to know about this model. One is it's technically not double extortion. Everybody calls it double extortion, but it's actually extortion with a blackmail chaser. But that's hard to explain. Double extortion looks catchier in a headline, so that's what everybody goes with. The second is when you look at a leak site like this, which is where all this stuff gets posted up on, it's only the people who have not paid normally go up on these sites. So that's not all their victims, that's just the ones who refused to pay and had their data breached as a result. And another thing to consider is if you're a board on the receiving end of something like this, by the time you notice the ransomware is deployed, the real crime, which is the complete compromise of your network and theft of all that data, happened maybe a week ago or weeks, depending on the actual case. So you're already far much more damaged than you think you are actually in at this point. So we took the actual victims of Nephilim and we kind of broke them down to see what did the victim profiles look like. And if you look at the countries that the different people on the leak site came from, we can see they heavily targeted North America. South America would be about second biggest, but they also hit targets in Europe, Asia, Oceania as well, right? So, but it was clearly that they were targeting North America when they could, when they had preference to do so. What's more interesting though is if we look at the actual breakdown of the victims, and Nephilim, strangely enough, in terms of the number of victims, they're about middle of the pack. So they're not terribly interesting compared to some of the others. Also in terms of the volume of data, just the sheer gigabytes uploaded, again, they're middle of the road. Although there's still 1 terabyte of data is not to be laughed at, right, at this stage. Where they're most definitely not middle of the pack, though, is in the revenue of the people they targeted. So on average, the revenue of those companies was 890 million plus. And even on the advertisements, when they're reaching out to affiliates, so we see in criminal forums, they specifically say they only want companies that are 200 million plus in revenue and ideally in the $1 billion ranges. So this is what their kind of market is they're going to. And if you think of that from a business strategy, it means that those people that they infect are going to be much harder to actually ransom. They're going to have better security software, InfoSec teams, all of those type of things. So they're harder nuts to crack, but if you crack them, any one of those is a massive payday, potentially, right? Because they have much more money on the books than the middle of the road. So this is just a kind of business strategy, if you like. If you think of it like in security terms, Nephilim target enterprise customers, right? Or customers to them are victims, right? But they target them. Whereas somebody like Conti is more like middle of the road SMB type people. So likewise, Nephilim are going to keep going in a negotiation a lot longer because they've invested so much into it, where someone like Conti will bail out of a negotiation if it's not going well faster because they just move on to the next one, right? So you can kind of tell from these things. So if we look from a technical level at the actual kill chain of these groups, so everybody here is familiar with the kind of the kill chain, but as you notice with these ransomware groups, and this isn't just Nephilim, it's all of them, the kill chains get very murky very quickly when we start looking into these. So if we start with the kill chain, you normally traditionally look at the reconnaissance and weaponization phase. That's the phase we actually have the least details on for any of these ransomware groups, because that's the part you don't see in your network. That all kind of happens on the attacker side. And actually, interestingly, none of that has anything to do with the actual ransomware itself. So the reason behind that is the kind of affiliate model split I mentioned before. So if you think about it, the affiliate is taking care of this kind of part, the first part of the kill chain, and in theory the ransomware gets deployed at the very end and does the other part of the kill chain. But it actually gets a little bit trickier than this, as you'll see as we go on here. So if we flick ahead into the kind of delivery and exploitation phase, which is where you would see the first kind of signs of them actually on your network. There's a couple of methods that Nephilim themselves favored. So Nephilim would regularly use Microsoft RDP. They would either use stolen credentials that they'd gotten somewhere else or just brute force to gain access. They also liked using network vulnerabilities. In their case, their favorite was the Citrix NetScaler vulnerability. Other ransomware groups use different network vulnerabilities, but similar approaches to this. So this kind of is generic, if you like. Once they'd use that for the initial beachhead, they would set about actually establishing kind of stronger control of the machine. So the way they would do this is they use tools like Process Hacker to delete or disable the security software on the machine itself, which then means they can kind of run around without any of those pesky ransomware stuff or anti-ransomware stopping them. They'd use PowerShell, which has really sped up their deployment. So in the past, a lot of this was manual. Now they've kind of scripted up their playbook. They just run scripts. The scripts rip through the network at very, very fast speed and do all the kind of standard things they would do. And of course, they make use of the big tobacco of the legitimate software industry, which is Cobalt Strike. Everybody has hacked Cobalt Strike. And they use this for backdoors to control the machines, to laterally move around, dump admin credentials and so on, and as the actual command and control to actually control the overall attack. And that's interesting because you would think the command and control happens at the end of the kill chain, so it's on the ransomware side, but this shows you how this gets kind of murky, right? A lot of the ransomware don't have command and controls because they don't need one, right? It's just deployed manually by the affiliate as they actually get onto the network itself. But it does make all this more murky to try and pick apart who did what. So then once they've done that, they need to escalate privileges a bit and move laterally around the network. Mimikatz is a favorite tool for that, for taking the credentials they've dumped and trying them on other machines. Also, they would use certain privilege escalation vulnerabilities that exist at the time just to get more admin rights in the machines that they have. And tools like AD-Find, which help them map the whole Active Directory network. And that's for two reasons. One, so they know where they want to go and target. But also, they quite often don't know who they just infected. Right? So they have to figure out what is this network, how big is it, and then who am I going to sell this network to? So for example, if they found out it's like 50 seats, they might say, okay, Nephilim are never going to pay for that. I'll go sell this to Klopp or Conti or somebody like that. Whereas if it's like a Fortune 500 company to have, Nephilim will probably pay them more money for that than anybody else would. And then the next stage, just before the ransomware is deployed, is exfiltrating all that data off the network. Normally they bring it to one server internally first and then pull it all out of there, either using something like FTP or Megasync, and others use Orclone and some other things to do this. But same idea. And then finally they deploy the actual ransomware component itself, right? And the ransomware isn't terribly interesting in terms of its technical capabilities. It uses a mixture between private and public keys, AES for encryption, and it just encrypts the files as you kind of expect it to do quite quickly. One important thing to point out here is everybody, when they get ransomed, the first thing they do is they Google and they go, name of ransom, decryptor, and they pray. And it is pointless because any modern ransomware will not have a decryptor. Think about it from the affiliate's point of view. Would you partner with a ransomware group that you put all this effort into and it gets wasted at the end because somebody just downloaded an executable off the internet, ran it, and they're back to being fine again? Just doesn't happen, right, in today's cases, unfortunately. So what does happen with these ransomwares was they constantly evolve their code to get faster or add features and so on that their customers want. And in the case of Nephilim, they keep adding different extensions to the end, which is this kind of word cloud that you see here. And what's interesting is if we take all those different variants and we just map them out, we actually use, this is a dendrogram, which is like a family tree, if you like. We use TLSH fuzzy hashing to do this. But essentially, if you think of this like a family tree, where the common ancestor is all the way on the left, and then the more you get to the right, the closer they are to each other, right? So the green stuff at the top was the original version of Nephilim was coded in C++. And then they changed to using the Go language after that. And as you can see, the important thing here is just the constant iterations, right? There's constant evolution over time of the actual Trojan, showing they're really evolving this thing. So if we put that all together on a MITRE map like this one here, it looks very complex. In fact, if you took this MITRE map and I showed it to you with no context whatsoever a couple of years ago and didn't tell you it was ransomware, you'd be forgiven for thinking this is probably an APT attack, because that's what a lot of these actually look like. Because criminals read APT reports too, right? And they take ideas from them and they're like, that's really smart, we should do that. And unlike an APT attack where it's probably more stealthy and they're trying to stay in the background of the network and not really damage you directly, apart from the information theft, With ransomware, it's going to be very visual and do damage because that's how it works, right? It's going to be visual and in your face. So we've wrapped all of this up into a report. I'm just highlighting here. It's free. Anyone can download it. It's 96 pages long, so I can't go through all of this. But if you Google double extortion and Trend Micro, you'll find it very easily. What I do want to highlight from the report is there's a ton of recommendations in it, and there's a big long section, but I'm going to call out the ones I think make the most difference when you're defending. And those are, first of all, don't ever expose RDP on the internet for any reason, ever. It always ends badly, and it will always end badly. The second one is patching. I know patching is a pain. I know all the issues with patching, and there's very good reasons why it's hard. But at the end of the day, some of these vulnerabilities are 4 years old, right? They have patches that would make a big difference in stopping these move around. Also, any of those like dual use tools like AD-Find or PowerShell or PSExec and so on, really limit which machines in the network are allowed to use them. Maybe the admin really needs them, but nowhere else in the network needs them, and that will really help. And finally, and most importantly from defenses, make sure you're defending against the affiliates, not the ransomware. If you put all your money into defending the ransomware component, but the attacker has complete control of the machine and turns off your fancy new shiny security software, it's useless. Instead, put all the energy, or as much energy you can, into the initial access and stopping the affiliates. If they never get in the network, they never deploy the ransomware, and you have a much better chance of defending. So what comes next? So just wrap up with 2 or 3 slides before I get killed by the iPad in the front. We've talked about double extortion, and a lot of people think that because of all this data leak part of double extortion, the logical thing to do is to move away from ransomware and actually be completely based on the data leakage itself. And actually, in reality, that's a really poor strategy. While the data leaking gets a lot of the media attention, it's kind of the weakest part of the whole chain, because at the end of the day, you're just relying on a criminal keeping their word that they pinky promise swear that they will delete all your data after they've taken it off the site, which they won't, right? And also, it means that these leak sites, very few people download that data. In the start, when there was only a few of these groups, people would download and look through the data. Now there's leaks every single day. No media has time to go through all of them, and they're all on Tor sites. I don't know if anybody's tried to download 100 gigabytes of data over Tor yet, but if you did, and you started last year, it's still running on your machine right now, right? So nobody actually looks at them unless it's a really political victim or something that is high profile. Instead, we are seeing some experimentation. Conti, for example, started to experiment by trying to sell the access to the data. So instead of just dumping it on the data site, they're saying, is there anybody out there who's a specialist in finance data? If so, we'll sell the data to you. We don't know exactly how the split of this would go, whether it's a one-time sale or to take a percentage of the profits, but that's one model that's been tried in the last couple of weeks. But they've since stopped this, so I don't know how successful it was. Then there's the triple extortion idea. This is simply adding DDoS on top. So if you think about when they're negotiating, if they have the ability to hit you with a DDoS attack to put extra pressure on you, it's quite easy to do. DDoS is very scalable, very cheap to do, so a lot of groups are going to adopt this, and it just makes sense. And then more importantly, quadruple extortion, which is the not marketing bullshit bingo, I promise, but yeah. But what quadruple extortion is essentially, they take the data leak that they have, they essentially scan through it for emails of all your customers, and they email them and basically say, company X got ransomed, we're going to leak all your data from them unless you get onto the CEO, by the way, here's their email, and tell them to pay the ransom now. And that puts the board in an impossible position where everybody knows they're under ransom, and if they don't pay it, their customers will blame them for their data going on the internet. And to finalize up, the last thing that we expect to change, we talked about how the kill chains kind of look like this to this point. That makes perfect sense when you are maybe selling or doing a ransom for 10,000. But if you're doing a ransom for 100,000 or 1 million, that is a ton of money to give away for no good reason. So what a lot of these groups are doing is bringing this in-house. They're maybe giving 20, 30% to the initial finder, like a finder's fee. And then they're actually the lateral movement part, they're just putting pen testers on salaries, which is saving them a ton of money in the process and basically increasing their margins. So almost every group will adapt this approach going forward. So that's it for me. I want to wrap up saying there's a whole bunch more we could talk about in ransomware. We haven't talked about things like the effects of the Colonial Pipeline or the HSE breach, or HSE attack, should I say, on the underground, or a whole bunch of other things we could get into. There's a load of other ransomware team talks today, so you can get to see some of that there. But I would be unforgivable if I didn't cover one last part of ransomware, which is critically important that you understand. And that is, of course, reminding you of how all this started back in 1989. Doesn't matter. Thank you very much, everybody. I think I'm out of time for questions.